Mornings are better with a warm beverage, even for Latter-day Saints. Meet Postum, the ideal coffee alternative and proud sponsor of This Week in Mormons podcast. Spotted on the coffee aisle at Smith's Grocery or at your local nearby store. Can't locate it? No worries. Order it at postum.com. Explore delicious recipes to tailor your Postum experience. Start your day off right with Postum.
Welcome to This Week in Mormons with Matt and Melissa. Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Matt. What's going on? How you been?
You know, I live in Rexburg, and
I know.
it's not super nice weather today, but there's not snow on the ground, and so it's almost May, right? And it feels like maybe spring is here.
I don't know. Every time you complain about Rexburg, here's what I have to tell you. You chose it. Okay. You knew what you were getting into when you moved there. I lived there for a month and do you remember? Okay, short detour. Remember I went to Rick's College back in the day for about 2 months. And then my little brother Matt one day came up in the middle of the night and moved me home because I was like, I can't take it anymore.
I do remember that.
Yeah.
I remember I came to visit you. It was in like October. And I was like, this is the coldest I've ever felt in my entire life. And I
including inside your heart, right?
Okay, well, we have a special guest with us today.
Yeah, sorry for the detour. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm going to call him Dr. Cameron because you earned that doctor in front of your name, and so I'm going to call him Dr. Cameron. But Cameron, we'll let you introduce yourself. Welcome to the show, Cameron.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you both. And I'm just an hour south of you, Matt, here in Pocatello. So our spring might come a little bit quicker than Rexburg, but it's warming up a little bit. We got some flowers poking out, and it's a beautiful day down here.
Yeah. So did you choose Pocatello the way that Melissa says I chose Rexburg?
You know, I had never been to Pocatello before I moved here. So I grew up in Ogden, Utah, and we were interviewing for different graduate programs, and Idaho State University had a clinical psychology program. And we thought, oh, Pocatello seems nice. We've driven past it before, but that was our first time stopping here. And then we loved living here while we were in grad school. And then after graduation and doing an internship down at BYU's Counseling Center in Provo, we actually moved right back. And all of our kids were born here in Pocatello. So it feels like we're native Idahoans now.
That's awesome. We grew up in Ogden, too. What high school did you go to?
So I went to Fremont. It's out in Plain City.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, we went to Bonneville.
This is how old I am. When I was graduating from high school, they were opening Fremont High School the very next year. And there was a contest to write like the school song for Fremont High. And I was a big Dr. Dre fan, so I tried something of the Dr. Dre Snoopy the Doggy Dog style. And I don't think that was your school song. I didn't ever go to Fremont High, but
I don't remember any Dr. Dre in the school song lyrics, but that would have been sweet. Too bad I didn't pick you.
Yeah, Matt was different back then. He also believed that he was going to name his 4 sons Rip, Spike, Spud, and Cruz. And you know, they're named religious names now. It didn't happen.
I didn't think about how I would have a wife who might have a say.
Yeah.
So Cameron, how long have you been in Pocatello?
Oh, let's see. We've probably been here 15, 16 years now. It seems like a long time. I guess my oldest is 15, so at least, 16, 17 years now if I think about it.
Wow.
Nice.
Okay, so you have a PhD in counseling psychology?
In clinical psychology, which they're pretty interchangeable. Yep.
Uh-huh. And so this means that you spend most of your time helping people with psychological disorders. Is that a fair way to describe it? Or I don't know. What do you do with your life?
Yeah. So I went to school for a long time to spend most of my day listening to people, which is what I really enjoy. So I don't dispense words of wisdom, but I do spend a lot of time witnessing what people are experiencing and going through. And I think I thought I was going to treat mental health disorders before I got into the program. And then I realized I'm really just caring for people and kind of witnessing things they've gone through and supporting them through either mental health challenges or often I work a lot with sexual health concerns or kind of concerns around faith. And often those two intersect, religion and sexuality, quite a bit. And so really I'm just there to help people give voice to their experiences and help them kind of get unstuck with some of the challenges they run into and navigate some challenging relationships. And then sometimes there are some significant mental health things going on as well that we can kind of navigate as well. So that's what I get to do is I get to form relationships. And one of the things that surprised me is some of my favorite relationships I've ever had, I never get to talk to anybody about because they're all confidential. I don't get to come home and tell my wife like, oh, wow, I had this great chat today. It's this kind of private world where I have these deep connections and meaningful conversations, and they're all kind of private.
Interesting. And now, do you do couples therapy or individual?
I do. I initially thought I was going to do more couples counseling, and then I started working with the couples, and I thought this is really hard. And I'm like, are people meant to be together? And of course they are, but there's a lot of challenges there. So I'd say a lot of my career has been in university counseling centers, and so I do a lot of individual work. I do lots of group therapy, which I love. And then the last few years, I've been doing more and more couples work, especially as I help people navigate kind of religious concerns and sexuality concerns.
Interesting. Okay, now I have a question, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but it will settle. It will settle a big fight. Okay.
Oh, no.
Okay. So, do you think there's the one, or do you think any two people can make a marriage work?
Are those my only two options?
No, but if I'm going to win this argument, then those are the only two. Okay,
Oh, no.
you can explain better.
Oh, no. Yeah, I don't think there's a one, and I don't think any two people could make it work either. I think there's a range of kind of traits and features that we have that might be complementary and areas that we could work together to build a really strong relationship. So I think there's a lot of people that you could build a really meaningful life with, and then maybe some that it's probably not going to be a great fit. But I don't think that there is the one.
Yeah.
So when I was a missionary, I don't know if you experienced this as a missionary, but when I was a missionary, we knew the answers to kind of everybody's problems. And and I would frequently tell people, if you're having marriage problems, it's because you either lack faith or humility. And if you have both of those, your marriage is going to work. Wait,
Matt.
You're laughing at that. You're making me feel like I lacked expertise. You're saying maybe that's not.
Oh, that's funny. I remember my missionary days. It seems like I knew a lot more then than I know now. And definitely after a PhD, it's like, I know even less. And then working in this field for a dozen years, the more and more I meet people, the more I recognize I don't have many answers. I know some principles that I can follow, and I kind of know how to ask the right questions to help people open up and to explore, but I don't know those right answers. And I think there's so much complexity with our mental health and dynamics and family backgrounds and how those intersect with each other that I don't have this ready-made advice and wisdom to dispel. But
yeah,
I think we definitely explore things, figure things out, but I think there's a lot more to it than that.
So it's more complicated than faith and humility. Or this is another one. All you need is a place to read and a place to kneel down and pray, and you'll be just fine. More complex than that?
I think so. And I remember hearing some of those messages at BYU's counseling center when we were down there. We had a huge counseling center at the time. We probably had over 30 psychologists and 20 interns, maybe 50 clinicians. And there were some people on that campus that thought, why do we have a counseling center for mental health? Like if people had enough faith, I don't think we would have mental health concerns or problems. And I thought, wow, we have one of the largest counseling centers in the nation down there to really support people's mental health and well-being. But I think those beliefs do kind of seek in that if we did have enough faith or studied enough or prayed enough, then we won't experience challenges or difficulties in relationships. We won't have mental health struggles or sexual health concerns. And that just isn't the realities of this experience in mortality.
Yeah. I do love the shift that the conversation has made in maybe the last decade or so and kind of differentiating between, mental health concerns and religion being able to solve everything. Also, Matt, I want you to know that throughout this conversation, I'm going to keep some tally marks of how many times I think, man, it must be hard being married to him. Right now you're at 2. Right now you're at 2. Okay. Just kidding. So you wrote a book that me and Matt have kind of started reading and been looking through. And it deals with those sexual health concerns, or I guess that's mainly what it deals with. Tell us about that a little bit. I'd like to get into it.
Yeah. So I wrote Confessions of an LDS Sex Researcher. It came out just a couple months ago. And I probably wrote it about 8 years ago. and
Okay.
was too scared to put it anywhere. I thought, I don't know if I'm ready to be this vulnerable and to tackle these sensitive topics. So it kind of sat on my digital shelf for 8 years until I kind of developed the courage and recognized that we do need to have more conversations around psychology and science and faith and sexuality. I just didn't want to be one of those people jumping into the ring to start to have those conversations. But I have so many of those chats in the counseling space, and so many people feel alone where they want to explore these topics, and yet they don't feel like there's many paths out there to do that. And so I always invite my clients to be more vulnerable and take some risks in their life. And sometimes I have to also try to do the same thing, which is kind of challenging. So this
Sure.
book was my effort to kind of retrace my steps about what it was like going through graduate school in a psychology program and learning about mental health and becoming a scientist, and then studying sexuality, and then also figuring out how to integrate faith in
Hmm.
these worlds. And so for a lot of people, bridging that divide makes them uncomfortable. And it's like, well, we should keep religion over here and science and mental health and sexuality over here. But for me, they're intimately intertwined and they really co-inform each other. And so I wanted to kind of bridge that gap and talk about a little bit about what my journey's been like as a Christian and Latter-day Saint, and as a psychologist and somebody who studies sex.
So there are some specific questions I have about things in your book, but I also have some questions about things that are not in your book. Um, shockingly, but I
Hold
do
on,
think
getting my tally marks out again. Go ahead.
I do think you have some unique insights into some of these things. So, question number one, I think there's a perception that COVID-19 did a real number on the mental health of young people in the country. Have you seen any of that in your experience?
Yeah, for sure. I've seen a much bigger impact, I'd say, the last year or so, where
Really?
things are like seemingly back to normal and we can hang out with grandma and grandpa at Thanksgiving again and classes are in person. But I get this sense of there's something we all went through collectively that really separated us. Went through major adjustments. We may have lost people. We may have got sick. We might be struggling with kind of long-term COVID symptoms. And now there's not a lot of dialogue around it. And people have a hard time putting their finger on what they're experiencing. And I've noticed, particularly with folks that are more neurodivergent, so people who are autistic or have ADHD, I've seen a bigger impact on being able to adjust and kind of come back to the way the world was before, but it's permanently different. And so
Mm-hmm.
there are challenges there where connections have been impacted. And for a lot of us, we get our sense of safety through relationships. And during COVID, it's like, oh, that sense of safety is actually dangerous. You can't be by people. You can't worship with people. You can't gather as a family. And now there's like this hesitancy to re-engage. And as mammals, that's where we feel a lot of our security in those relationships. And it's been difficult to navigate that, particularly with, I think, the heightened polarization around politics that has separated people and fears around health. It just seemed like it's been a lot more challenging to come back together after that experience.
Hmm.
So like as a broad prescription for society, would you say we need to have more conversations? We need to get together more often? Like, how could we broadly as a society sort of address some of that need that's out there for connection?
Oh, I love your ideas. Getting together, having those conversations. And I think, at least the rhetoric I see online is people want to have conversations where they're maybe sharing their views and trying to convince others to join their camp. But I think having conversations to be curious about people's experiences and perspectives and what they're going through. So really sharing to learn and connect rather than talking at people to change. I think that's the thing that probably needs to shift more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. I work in a high school, and I've noticed a couple things in relation to what we're talking to. The first one is that it seems like there's this chunk of students, grade wise, age wise, who missed the basic socialization that normally
Yeah.
happens in that transition from junior high to high school because they were not in school, they were online. And so they kind of missed that normal and natural time to have that socialization experience. And so they're kind of experiencing one thing. But then the other thing that's happening is there has been a lot more focus on these mental health words and terms. And
Mm.
so people are a lot more comfortable saying things like, I'm depressed or I have anxiety. But to me, it seems like we're talking about it more, but we're not talking about it in the right ways. Like we're not actually asking for help, asking for therapy or getting help. We're just kind of like talking about it more and throwing around terms, but maybe things that we don't actually understand. Do you think that's true?
I think you're spot on. So the last year I started a radio show through our university, through NPR, just about that very topic where I think stigma around mental health has gone down and help seeking has gone down. But our understanding of what mental health is really low. And so I hear people talking about, well, I have anxiety or I have depression without very little understanding of what those clinical terms even mean. And then I think people sometimes get stuck when they over-identify with a clinical label. And so like I work with folks that struggle with pornography and for many years of their life, they over-identified with the term addiction, that I'm an addict. And they kind of lose sight of their other characteristics and values and who they really are. And over-identifying with those clinical labels actually keeps people stuck. And so like with pornography concerns, they actually might end up struggling with viewing for longer periods of time. Or if they say, well, I have depression, I am depression, you might feel more depressed for an extended period of time. Or it's like, well, I have anxiety, I can't go to these parties, or I can't reach out to people or have these chats because I have anxiety. These are designed to be descriptions of experiences, but not things that we have or possess. Just like if we said, I have sadness or I have joy, it'd be like, wait, what? Like we feel sad and we experience happiness. We feel down, we feel anxious, but those are temporary states. But when we over-identify with those labels, they become part of who we are. And that's what actually makes some of these mental health challenges even worse. And so there needs to be a balance where stigma is down, which is great. Help seeking is up, which is great. And now we need to have more understanding of what these terms really mean.
So this is something you touch on in your book, and you don't say it exactly the same way, so it's okay if you say that's not what I meant. But I noticed in your book, like on the one hand, the church says same-sex attraction because we don't want people to identify as gay, because identifying as gay is very similar to the sorts of things you're talking about. On the other hand, we talk about pornography as an addiction, and then that creates an identity at the same time where it's I'm an addict to pornography. So that isn't, don't you think that's a weird sort of like paradox there, right? Like on the one hand, we don't want anyone to develop this as an identity or as a seeing themselves as this way when it comes to same-sex attraction or gayness. But on pornography, we're a little bit more comfortable with this idea of removing the agency and saying, well, you're just addicted to this and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? I love how you point that out and put those together, because there's a major difference between a behavior and an identity. And I think we mix those together. So when there's identities we're uncomfortable with, we would say things like same-sex attraction or this is a person with autism. But if there's identities that we embrace or are comfortable with, we don't separate ourselves. We don't say, oh, here's Melissa, person with womanness. It's like, well, I'm assuming that Melissa may identify as a female. We wouldn't separate that. Or, here's Cameron, person with doctorhood. It's like, well, he's a doctor, he's a psychologist. Or I'll just point about my ethnic background. Here's Cameron, a person with Scottishness in his background. It's like, that's Scottish. So identities that we're comfortable with, we're okay labeling those. And so there has been a shift around some of these identities, particularly around autism. We're saying a person with autism is creating space because there's some stigma and discomfort around that label. But the more we push identities away, the more mental health impact there is. And so there is kind of a shift. We're saying, oh, I'm autistic. That is part of my identity. Or I'm trans or non-binary or I'm gay. That is part of who I am. And that actually lowers distress, mental health suffering, facilitates our identity and understanding of who we are. But if we over-identify with symptoms or behaviors, that kind of does the opposite, where we do get stuck with feeling more depressed or struggling more with unwanted behaviors. So I think that's the major distinction, behavior versus identity.
Interesting. Well, and I think in the church, we are really uncomfortable talking about things like pornography addiction or, like I'm not going to raise my hand in Sunday school and be like, this is the thing. And so, my experience has been like, if you go to the bishop, he's like, no, we've got this great program. Just go to the program, go over there and solve it, but we don't really have a good way to talk about it amongst each other. Do you think that's fair?
Absolutely. I think that's the challenge where in our faith and culture, sex is very sacred. Just like temple worship is very sacred. And so we tend not to talk about those things. And it's like, well, then it kind of develops a sense of secrecy, or if there is any discomfort or questions, it's like, who do we go to? We can't talk about temple worship or experiences with anybody. We can't talk about sexuality or experiences or questions with anybody. And so, as we're growing up, there's a part of this that recognizes that if we can't talk about it, maybe there's something shameful about it, or there's something I'm doing wrong about it. And so if I have interest or curiosity around sexuality and yet we're not allowed to talk about it, maybe there's something wrong with me. And then I start to feel really bad and withdraw. And we need those humans, like we talked about earlier, for connection and a sense of safety and well-being. And shame is suggesting we do the opposite, where it's saying, it's too vulnerable to put yourself out there and let people see you for who they really are. And so shame shares this narrative within ourselves that, if people knew who you are, they would reject you, that you wouldn't be lovable or that you wouldn't be worthy. That's one of our religious terms for feelings of shame is you're not worthy. And so we start to withdraw. And it's that shame experience that's probably at the root of many of the mental health concerns, but definitely the root of things like unwanted pornography viewing. So there's been research in just in the last year or two that shows that people that struggle with pornography viewing, when they're feeling shame, it actually increases sexual desire within an hour or two. And that feels really unfortunate. Like people that don't struggle with porn, shame doesn't lead to any changes in sexual arousal. Feelings of self-esteem does. So the more you're feeling good about yourself, the more you want to connect with a partner and have a sexual experience. But if you struggle with a compulsive behavior that's facilitated shame, your nervous systems learn that we can't tolerate that for very long. We need to connect with somebody, but we can't take a risk with our partner or say people in our life. Let's see if we can have a sexual experience that requires no vulnerability, no risk whatsoever, just to get a breath from that shame space that we've been in. Then after you take that breath by looking at porn and masturbating, those feelings of shame come right back and we withdraw, and that cycle repeats. So if we could talk more openly about the human condition and mental health and these feelings, it would be a lot safer to have this dialogue, and struggles with things like pornography would go down tremendously.
Yeah, I love this shift in perspective. It makes so much sense to me. For several years, my husband and I kind of had this not calling, but calling, where when somebody would come to the bishop, struggling with pornography, they would ask as a couple for us to just walk with them and talk with them. If they wanted someone to go to meetings with them, cool. A lot of the times it was just like, will you go on walks with, the wife every day and be somebody that they can talk to? And I can't even tell you how much just having other people to talk to about experiences that you don't normally feel like you can talk to people about.
Yep.
You're right. Like it does build like this connection and this vulnerability, but I never really saw it from this perspective that you just explained before. But really just the ability to have those conversations really made a big difference. So that's an interesting shift in perspective.
I love that you had that unofficial calling, because I think
Yeah.
in so many ways, connection is the antidote to challenges with intimacy or pornography concerns. But shame's convincing us not to connect. It's too scary. But you were offering that medicine that maybe they didn't recognize they need. And sometimes there is so much fear of, if I opened up about this, what would happen? But it's the opening up that reduces the need for that behavior.
And
So
sometimes you feel like you can't talk to your spouse about it because you're mad at them or you feel betrayed or hurt by them. Yeah, it is interesting. So is this like if I went into therapy, for example, is this the model? Is like we're going to do more talking and less blaming, or is it a behavior toward type of model? Or tell me what you think.
Yeah, so I have found that judging people or ourselves rarely leads to changes in behavior.
Yeah.
I found that understanding what's going on readily leads to changes in behavior.
Yeah.
So that's the model. Is I've never looking for who's to blame here. Is it you or your partner? Is it your mom from back in the day? But it's like, let's understand the factors about what's going on that's contributing to whatever struggle that you have. And so people that do struggle with compulsive sexual behaviors tend to be a lot more self-critical, judgmental, less forgiving, less compassionate. And it turns out all the things you need to change those behaviors is more self-compassion, understanding, and kindness. And those are the last things you want to offer yourself,
Hmm.
because you hate yourself. You feel disgusted, and you feel like, I'm rebelling against God and hurting my partner. I don't deserve any of those things. It's like, well, that's actually what's going to lead to the change.
Hmm.
And so a lot of what I do with people is we got to understand what's going on. And too often we focus on the behavior as like, oh my gosh, what is going on? Like if people have an eating disorder and it's like, you're not eating or you're purging. Why would you do something like that? Or you're looking at sexual images. Why would you do something like that? And so for me, those are just symptoms, just like a cough. And so if you went to the doctor and you said, I got this terrible cough, and he's like, well, what I want you to do is just not cough anymore this week, then you'll be good to go.
Right.
I don't know if I'd ever go back to that doc again. But they might run some tests and see if you've got a cold or the flu. You might need to rest, get some soup, have some antibiotics. And if you take care of what's going on underneath that, the cough kind of goes away. And eating concerns, pornography concerns are fairly similar. That's just a symptom that something's off. And so if we can understand, what is driving this unwanted cough? Can we address that need? The things we don't want, people don't want to struggle with eating or viewing sexual images. Those kind of take care of themselves, but those things are so loud and they have moral implications and people are really scared about those that they get the focus. But really we want to address what's driving those symptoms.
So my undergraduate is in psychology. And I remember when I would tell people I want to study psychology, they'd be like, it's really hard to study that and keep your faith in Jesus Christ because that's kind of like a field of the devil or something like that. And I do notice as I look around like academia, various fields, there are not a lot of LDS psychologists. Like it is of all the fields that attract members of our church, that like there's fewer of us per capita in that field than in other fields. And then related to that, there's this tremendous need for therapists, and in particular, people that specialize in sexual therapy. And I can only imagine what it's like telling your friends and family, I've decided to study sexual psychology. Like, did people say to you, what's wrong with you that you're studying that kind of a thing?
Oh, for sure. And I shared some of those experiences in that book. And I remember some of the research I did at Idaho State is we were looking to see if pornography viewing functioned like an addiction, like other substance use concerns, because you probably both heard the same message as I did, that viewing porn is an addiction. And so when I was in grad school, I needed a research topic. And I heard somebody in church talking about that very thing where, porn is going to destroy relationships and it's a terrible addiction. And that was, how long ago was that now? 16, 18 years ago now, where I thought, I wonder what the research says about that. And I was just really surprised that there wasn't any research to demonstrate that porn was an addiction. And I thought that was shocking. I thought, of course, there's got to be research. Like everyone knows this is an addiction. And so I sought out to do that research. And so we were recruiting people into our lab who struggle with viewing of pornography. And we monitored their brain activity through EEG as they viewed sexual images in our lab. And I thought we'd be the first lab to show that porn was an addiction like other substance use problems. And we didn't find that. And that's science. Is like you have an idea, but data needs to drive those conclusions. And so as I was doing that research study, I was working with a colleague in our clinic there, and she was LDS. And she said, Cameron, I've heard that you're showing people pornography and monitoring their brain activity. Does your bishop know about this? And I said, well, actually, my bishop's the dean of health professions, and he asks me about my research every other month because he has questions about it. So he definitely knows about it, and he's excited that I'm doing it. Because you're right, there's not a lot of people of faith doing that kind of research that needs to be done. And so the interesting thing, like around pornography, is religious folks actually view porn at lower rates than other folks, but tend to struggle with it at higher rates. So here's a concern that religious people are struggling with, and yet not a lot of the research is done by fellow religious individuals. And the same thing with the treatments. And so there is kind of a divide there where there might be people interested in sexuality, but maybe not exploring a concern that maybe more religious people might struggle with, because religious people are uncomfortable doing some of that research. So sometimes I don't know why I do this, where it's like, this needs to be done. Let's jump in there and do it. But it leads to some uncomfortable conversations. And then I think on the other end, I remember defending my dissertation. There was a faculty member that asked me the same question on the other end, where it's like, I loved your research. This was great. If your grandma's asked you, what are you studying? What would you tell her? And so for me, this is science.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in figuring how things work so I can help people overcome the struggles that they have. And then I sometimes forget about that there's taboos around these things, and there's discomfort around diversity, and all these worlds start to converge. And that's been my life journey so far.
So when you're in a testimony meeting and somebody shares their testimony that pornography is an addiction, do you want to raise your hand and say, I object?
It's honestly tough. I remember sitting in a gospel doctrine class a few years ago, and somebody was sharing their testimony about how impactful the church's addiction recovery program has been, and just sharing their testimony that is the way and the only way to overcome challenges with pornography. And I'm actually not as courageous as I wish I was. And I kind of kept my mouth shut and really have struggled with that because I've worked with so many people that are very faithful Latter-day Saints and struggle with porn and go to those addiction recovery programs. And they feel a lot of connection in those groups, which I think is the best part of those groups is, oh, I'm not alone. And these people are like me. That's great. But that program is designed to be more of a support group. It's not designed to shift behavior.
Right.
And so I've worked with a lot of folks where they go through there and it's like, I feel better about myself, but I'm still viewing either the church isn't true or there's something really wrong with me. And it's like, oh, no, please no. Like we have evidence-based approaches that can help you reduce this behavior. And that's what I learned at BYU at their counseling center. They've been using an approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, for over 20 years at this point. And they don't use the church's addiction recovery program down there because addiction approaches don't have evidence that they're helpful in changing pornography viewing. But ACT is helpful. So they did the research down at Utah State in Logan, and they found that folks that did 10 or 12 sessions of ACT were able to reduce their viewing by over 90%.
Wow.
And that's so after over a decade of struggle and trying all kinds of approaches. And so BYU's been offering that for over 20 years with tremendous success. And so for me, I love being able to offer those approaches that do have research support, that do address the underlying cold that's driving that cough, that don't focus on this addiction piece. Because now we do have more research that suggests that people that believe they're addicted may then go on to view at higher rates and get stuck. That language kind of keeps us stuck. But if we can address what's underneath it, we can start to shift that behavior.
So I need you to explain just a little bit more what ACT is, what that idea is.
Yeah, so acceptance and commitment therapy comes from the cognitive behavioral therapy tradition and infuses a lot more mindfulness.
Okay.
Which is kind of a term that's everywhere. Everyone's kind of into mindfulness, so it loses a lot of meaning. But with mindfulness, we actually want to get more curious about our experiences. So we want to spend more time observing our thoughts and our emotions and our physical sensations without trying to control those or change those or judge them away. And that's kind of the opposite of what our mind typically does, and maybe what society has taught us, and maybe what the addiction kind of approach is, where we view things like our thoughts are the problem, and our emotions are the problem, and our sexual urges are the problem. If you had enough self-control and could kind of wrestle those to the ground and vanquish those, you wouldn't struggle with depression or eating concerns or OCD or pornography. You just need to learn how to control all that. And what we found is attempting to control those internal states actually amplifies them. So if you have thoughts where I'm not a good person, I don't like that thought. Why am I having that thought? I can't believe I'm having that thought. I'm such a terrible person for having that thought. The more you struggle with those thoughts, the bigger they get. And it's probably the same experience that maybe you have, or maybe, hopefully it's not just me on Fast Sunday, where it's like, I usually do pretty good till Fast Sunday, and I think about food more than any other time. And it's like, well, I shouldn't think about food. This is about connecting with God and a higher power, and this is a way to get more kind of connection to spirit in my life. But wow, I hate this experience. This is really unpleasant. And all I can think of food, if I was just more righteous, I wouldn't struggle with this as much. Like I have way more judgmental thoughts and struggles around my emotions and my belief in myself on Fast Sunday, because there's pressure in those moments. And we do the same thing with mental health and around sexuality, where we need to get rid of these things. If I didn't have an urge to view pornography, I wouldn't be viewing porn. So the urge has got to be the problem. I got to get rid of that. And so ACT is really the opposite. And
Okay.
if we can create more space for these thoughts and feelings and urges without needing to change them or judge them, those things can be there. And we actually don't need to act on those. So I can have a tremendous urge to go to the drinking fountain at church on Fast Sunday and take a wonderful sip, or to have a snack. Or often I get an urge to check my phone, to check messages, especially when the little vibrator goes off and it's like, there's a ding there. I gotta check it. And if we're not mindful or aware, we just reflexively obey urges. We scratch our nose if there's an itch, we eat a snack because we're stressed, even though we're not hungry, or we check our phone, or we look at sexual images, or we scroll on social media, you name it. Mindfulness allows us to observe those impulses or urges. And when we can observe them, we now have the choice to disobey them. We have the urge to check our email. We can notice that and say, I don't really need to do that right now. Or for me, after I eat, my urge is to go have chocolate. That's my favorite thing to do. Or when I'm stressed, chocolate, or overwhelmed, chocolate, but I'm not hungry. And it's just an emotional state I'm trying to control with a behavior. So the more I can slow down and notice that, the more I can decide, do I need to have more chocolates right now? Or do I need to scroll through social media again? Do I need to check my email for the 20th time in the last 10 minutes? Or should I engage more in my relationships or focus on the things that are truly important to me, that matter to me most? And that's the shift that ACT is entertaining, that we're spending too much time trying to fix problems, and that has actually become the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Let's shift our time and energy and focus on the things that matter to us most. And some of these things we struggled with might start to take care of themselves.
And the noticing the thought, you have to do that without judging yourself for having the thought, right? Like you have to notice without judgment, right?
That's it. So the two things that are going to amplify those thoughts are trying to suppress or control it and judging it.
Okay.
Judging actually might amplify that thought more than trying to control it.
Okay. Okay. And so in I just, as a question, because I know a lot of people who have depression, for example, they have thoughts that are really negative or bad or telling them that they're a bad person. Does this work in that sort of a situation? How does this work like that?
Yeah, it's the same thing. So ACT is an evidence-based approach for most mental health concerns,
Mm-hmm.
including depression, OCD, substance use, eating concerns, anxiety. Because
Okay.
what's driving those mental health concerns is the same. Is we have these unpleasant thoughts, especially with depression. That's a great example where you
Mm-hmm.
might feel like you're worthless, or that people don't care about you, or you're lazy, or sometimes you have suicidal thoughts that people would
Mm-hmm.
be better off if you weren't here anymore. And those thoughts are really scary when they show up. And so
Right.
our reflex is, those thoughts are the problem. We need to get rid of those. We need to judge those and say, those are not good thoughts to have. I can't believe I'm having those thoughts. And it kind of amplifies those. And so what happens over time is people actually start to become depressed about having depression. Just like they might still feel really anxious about experiencing anxiety. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a primary part and a secondary part that we all experience moments where we're down or anxious. That's a primary pain that we can't escape when we're sick or we lose loved ones. That's part of this mortal experience. When we try to avoid it or control or escape, that actually causes suffering. And that part is optional. But usually that's what people are coming into counseling for is, I've gone through some really traumatic things, or I'm struggling with my sexuality, or I'm feeling really down, or I'm having these thoughts of harming myself. And I don't want to have those. And I'm trying to get as far away from them as I can. That's what leads to the impairment and the suffering. And so it may not feel good, like if you're caught in quicksand, which if you watch cartoons, it seems really dangerous and everywhere, and it's really not in real life. But the antidote to quicksand is if you're stuck in it, you actually lay down in it. You actually get in more contact with the thing that you're stuck in, and you're safer. It may not feel good, and that's not our instinct, but that's how you safely get out of cartoon quicksand. And mental health stuff is the same. The closer you can get to those things that feel uncomfortable or unpleasant, the safer you are. And the more you then you can engage in things that matter to you most.
Yeah, that makes a lot of
So,
sense.
so when I was in an ecclesiastical role, if somebody came to me and they had a problem with pornography or something like that, I had three solutions available to me. Number one was the 12-step program, the addiction recovery program. There wasn't a lot of success that I saw with that. specifically with pornography. Another one that they would do for a while is indexing. There was this video they had out there.
Oh,
You do some
Yes.
indexing and your desire for porn will go away because you're doing indexing. And then the third was like refer them to LDS Family Services,
mm.
or I don't know what it's called now. But again, with that, I had no idea like who they were going to go see and like what was going to happen there. So if somebody came to you like not as a bishop, but as a professional, and they said, I'm looking for help with my mental health challenges. I'm afraid of psychologists because they study weird things like sexuality and they scare me. I only trust faithful members of the church because I'm afraid they might poison my mind or something like that. Like, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's seeking professional help?
Yeah, I would say that it's important to find a good fit, but also be open. So there are a lot of people that probably don't share the same faith background or gender or ethnic background, but they may be just the person you need to help you navigate the mental health concerns or relationship challenges you're going through. But I get that sense that sometimes there is that fear that if they're not part of my faith background, they might try to impose some beliefs or values that are inconsistent with my own faith. And that generally just hasn't been my experience in the profession. That our goal as a psychologist is to actually help people live within their values and their belief and their standards, and to really celebrate their identity and background and be curious about their experiences and what they're going through. That's generally been my experience. And I think sometimes there is this belief that if you're a member of the church, you'll automatically be safe. It's like I remember doing a Fifth Sunday at a congregation, and they didn't ask me about any of my qualifications about, can you talk about grief or trauma? They just asked me if I had a temple recommend. I'm like,
Okay.
well, yes, I do have a temple recommend. And they're like, oh, good, you should be good then. It's like, but we're talking about grief and trauma. Like there was a horrific fire in our community that destroyed 60, 70 homes. People were displaced. It's like, we need somebody that understands what this is like. And so I think you probably need a combination of somebody that maybe understands where you're coming from, but that definitely can help you navigate those experiences that you're going through.
Yeah. Well, this kind of reminds me of a part of your book where you talked about, I think what you said is that counseling is sacred.
Mm.
Yeah. Talk to me about that a little bit. I've definitely had those experiences. But tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, that one gives me pause, just reflecting on that and kind of the sanctity of that space. And
Yeah.
maybe that ties into something that Matt asked earlier where, can you be a psychologist and a Christian or a Latter-day Saint? And I remember asking myself those questions early on in my training. And so I went to the scriptures and I thought, I'm going to study the life of the Savior and hear his words. And I turned to the Sermon on the Mount and thought, this is what the Savior has asked me to focus on those who are oppressed or marginalized, that have no voice, that are brokenhearted. And I think about, wow, these are the people that I work with in a counseling capacity. These are the people that are pushed aside. And then I think about those parables with the Good Samaritan, where here's somebody that's deemed unclean by society and church members pass by them. And I thought, who do we deem unclean in our society today, or often in church kind of culture? And often it's gender minorities, sexual minorities, it's people struggling with pornography or mental health concerns, or those struggling with suicidal thoughts, where it's like, oh, those folks are unclean. We need to tell them to index more and then they should be clean and should be good. And so the more I studied the Savior, it's like, wow, that is where he would be. He would be with these individuals that are hurting, that are suffering. And as I've thought about that, I thought, oh yeah, this is in line with my covenants. And I think about my covenants as I've been asked to bear one another's burdens and mourn with those that mourn, and to comfort those that stand in need of comfort, and to be in those places where the Savior would be. And so over the years, as I've thought about this, it's like, oh, this profession fits my covenants so well. And I never really anticipated that kind of going into this journey. And so it does feel like a sacred space where people are often at their lowest, most vulnerable moments, and feel really scared to open up about things about sexual abuse history, or challenges in their marriage, or a faith crisis, or they struggle with pornography. And they feel terrified that if I open up, you're going to judge me, you're going to reject me, you're going to say that I'm broken and helpless or crazy. And none of those things are true. As I work with people in those moments, those are the most profound feelings of connection that I've felt. And it's amazing to feel so much compassion and empathy for people as you witness that suffering. And I think about Christ and the atonement. That is the ultimate act of empathy. And it feels like a sacred space to be in, to share in that, to be with somebody where they're truly hurting and support them. And so I may not have these automatic answers to make it all go away, which isn't actually that helpful. Is to really be there with each other through those moments and help maybe pivot them to having a little bit more kindness, which is one of our great commandments, to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. I think a lot of us struggle with that last part. And I think a lot of that loving God and neighbors is contingent on how well you can care for yourself and be willing to get back up when you struggle or make mistakes and have some compassion and understanding. And it does feel like a sacred space to be able to help people develop love towards themselves.
So I have another question. So I know a couple of people, more than one couple, that after they got married, they decided to go to marriage counseling early in their marriage because they said, if we learn the tools to have a successful marriage early on, then it's going to be good for us later on when we actually have more difficult challenges. And it kind of made, they say it made them a stronger couple and it really hurt their marriage. And I've met a few other people that say they do the same thing with therapy, that they send their children to therapy on a regular basis, almost like people do with a physical checkup with a medical doctor, just to kind of, so that if there is anything, you kind of catch it early and they don't wait until there's a big problem. Do you think that that's a healthy approach?
I love that. Just like we go to personal training if we want to get more fit and healthy, not necessarily because there's an injury or something pathological going on, but we value our physical health. Or you may meet with a nutritionist or a dietitian, maybe not that you're struggling with an eating disorder, but it's like, I want to eat better and be healthier. Or we go to wellness checks or prevention checks with our doctors and we get things checked out. I just got my physical for the first time in like 10 years. It should be like every year where we should get a checkup because I value my physical health. And it's the same thing around mental health and relationships. So I love that idea of, as a couple, and I think back, I've been married 18 years now, I think 18, next month, 18 years. And I thought, I didn't know anything about myself. And I didn't really know, I didn't have very many skills about how to have open, helpful conversations. I didn't anticipate how my family background would be very different in informing my expectations than my wife's family background. So we both grew up outside of Ogden. We're both Latter-day Saints, similar values. That's going to be a piece of cake. I'm amazed that our marriage is so good and healthy the way it is. It's like we had no skills, no understanding. And so I view couples counseling as a relationship coach, where it's like, let's help you understand who you are and let's help your partner understand who they are and what you're both bringing into this relationship. What are your strengths? What are your growth areas? How can we work together to make this healthier? And it's the same thing with individual therapy. And that's what I like about ACT, is for me, ACT is the manual for our mind that we never got. And so sometimes we get a car and say, I don't know how to operate this thing, but you open the glove box, there's a manual in there. And if you read it and study it, you know how to take care of your car. It works pretty well. Our mind has one too, and it's ACT. And so the more I've studied ACT, the more I've helped folks with these principles, the more I understand how my mind works, that our mind's actually trying to help us. It's not trying to make you miserable or destroy your life, but sometimes it uses strategies in unhelpful and peculiar ways. But the more you can understand it, the healthier you can be. And so you can learn a lot of those principles, even if you're not in crisis or have a diagnosable mental health condition, you can still benefit from counseling or relationship counseling because it's just teaching you how to live a healthier life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the more I live life, the more I think there isn't really anybody that's like normal. Like there's no such thing. Like we all have things going on in our heads, whether we're aware of them or not. But that's kind of what I think. Like there's no normal.
Amen. And in fact, ACT has a term called destructive normality, that if you believe that there is a normal and you need to get there, that's probably what's making you sick.
Interesting.
I think we found my problem.
But if you're like, oh, I'm feeling sad, that's not normal. Something's wrong with me. That's going to cause a lot of suffering and distress. There's so many things in life that are quite normal. The absence of emotion is not healthy. Like we should be feeling things all of the time, quite distressful things. And having all kinds of thoughts. Some of them are helpful, some are silly, some of them are pretty wild. That's a normal functioning mind. But to believe that, well, I need to have this much faith or this level of happiness or control my sexual urge, that's what's normal. That's what causes problems for us.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cameron, it has been so great chatting with you and getting to know you better. If our listeners want to find your book, where would they find it?
Yeah, you can track it down on Amazon, Confessions of an LDS Sex Researcher. And if you're interested in some of my research and some of my free resources on mental health and sexual health, I did a TED Talk on some of these topics around unwanted pornography viewing and mindfulness. That's a helpful way to approach it. You can find all that on my website at CameronStaley.com.
That's
great.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hey, listener, talk to you again next week.